Going into chapter 15, usually we would breeze through the knowledge objectives, but there is something that I want to stop and talk about very briefly. We will go through all these knowledge objectives with the PowerPoint by proxy, but there's one thing I want to call attention to. Y'all make a note, something like this, because it's some low-hanging fruit for a test. That LCES model for a cave-in incident and other incidents for shielding like collapse and stuff like that. That LCES, lookouts, communications, escape routes, and safe zones or safety zones. That is what LCES stands for, and I can all but guarantee that you may see that again coming up. So we looked at a list. These are called the technical rescue trap, but we saw a list similar with hazmat incidents, but tech rescue goes a little bit deeper than that. They have a lot of other disciplines that are involved. So there may be a part 3 to this depending on how much I can cover. So rope, high angle and low angle, the difference between those, a high angle rescue is going to be one where a majority of the weight, a majority of the weight for the rescue is supported by the ropes and the systems. Like they're dangling on the rope and their feet are dangling. A low angle rescue is going to be one of those situations, car in a canal, car down an embankment or something like that, where we have somebody in a basket. We have some rope systems that are there to help, but a majority of the weight of the victim and some of the equipment is going to be supported by the rescuers and just assisted with the ropes and the equipment. Confined space, I know I told you we were going to talk more about that from the hazmat chapter in here, and we will. Trench and cave type rescues, cave-in rescues are going to be included in that confined space world. Structural collapse, we'll talk about how multifaceted that can be. And then some of the other disciplines we will get to as we go through. So this is a list that's a little more expanded than the one in the hazmat world because we have a little bit more compliance to worry about here. Some of the standing ones from hazmat are the HAZWOPER, HAZCOM, bloodborne pathogens type stuff. Permit required confined spaces. OSHA 1910-146 is the regulation for permit required confined spaces, and that is going to bring forth a lot of information when we start talking about the hazards of a confined space. Something that's going to be a little out of the ordinary, and this is actually a typo in the PowerPoint. 29 CFR 1910.1926, that is not the case. So we would scratch out 1910 there, and excavations and trenching operations falls under CFR 1926. That is the construction standard. 1910 is general industry standards. 1926 is construction, and trenching and excavation has its own subpart in that standard. I believe it's subpart F, but I would have to double check on that for you. Same thing, we talked about the importance of an assistant safety officer. Same rules apply. If that appointed incident safety officer does not have the technician level training or the training level required for mitigation of that incident, they need to appoint an assistant safety officer that does. And in this case, for rescue, it would be ASORT. General function as an ISO. This also goes hand in hand with some of the tactical priorities at our technical rescue incident. Number and location of victims. What kind of situation are they in? Are we thinking a rescue or recovery? And the integrity of the surrounding environment. That could be a building for a high angle rescue. Do you have glass that's unstable or unaccounted for from a trench and excavation standpoint? Do you have dirt that's unstable? Do you have earthen material that is causing a greater risk of secondary collapse, so forth and so on? Taking all that into effect, we want to determine the best place for the command post, and the ISO may be giving some input on that. Overall risk-taking profile. This is all things that the incident safety officer is going to contribute to the IAP, and something that we would continually review and adjust based on the needs of the scene, based off of what's going on. So your overall risk-taking profile, rescue mode versus recovery mode, that's also a risk-benefit thinking prompt. It's also a risk-benefit thinking mentality there, versus when you forsake those two and you're either somewhere in between on incident stabilization mode. That could be an example of incident stabilization could be shoring for a building collapse, could be shoring for a trench, could be stabilization of some of that glass that I was talking about for a high angle rescue on a building where a window or two might have been broken. Control zones can be implemented the same as hazmat, hot, warm, and cold, but there is going to be a specific level of PPE for each of those, and it is going to look drastically different at times than the hazmat world. It could be as simple as helmet, gloves, and eye protection, helmet, gloves, eye and ear protection. Whatever the hazard is that you are confronted with, you want to make sure that the PPE matches that. Same personnel safety systems. We harped on accountability, comms, and rehab and hazmat. I don't really feel the need to harp on it here. And traffic issues that interfere with medevac. If you get to a point where you are using a helicopter for this incident, it has its own little excerpt later on in the chapter. We'll talk about issues with helicopters to the best of my ability when we get to that point. Risk level language, rescue mode. That's us taking a very calculated approach and throwing every resource that we have on scene to effect a rescue for somebody who's still alive. And we think that we can do a decent job at getting to them. A recovery mode is obviously when we see that savable life is not there and we have to move into the slow down, take a methodical approach. We may have to do some complete hazard mitigation at that point. And there could also be that work being done all around that for the stabilization of the incident. So some of these can run parallel, if you will, at the same time. When you switch from rescue to recovery, it is important to have people around understand if you can't get rid of the distressed or the distraught onlookers, you have to do what you can to inform those people of what's going on or get them out of the way so they don't feel compelled to jump in. I've never been to a specific incident like this, but would-be rescuers happen a lot, based off of research, happen a lot for the trench rescue world and the confined space rescue world. Thankfully, all of the confined space rescues that I've been involved with have been pretty isolated incidents, and it's only 2 of them, granted. But they've been pretty isolated incidents, and you didn't have a large crowd that was wanting to help get in your way or become those would-be rescuers. Control zones, like I said, hot, warm, and cold zone. The system is similar to hazmat, but what constitutes each one of those is going to be a whole lot different here. At times, it could be measured in inches. There are inches, there are foot identifiers or situations that require action, such as the dirt that you see in some of those pictures at the edge of a trench is called a spoil pile. It's required that a spoil pile be at least 2 feet back, 24 inches back from the lip of a trench. So that's an example of how this could be a game of inches or a game of feet. Obviously, your ISO or whoever they designated as their ASO, if need be, is going to help secure and establish some of those boundaries, or the other way around. Establish and secure. Required levels of PPE for each one of those zones. It's dictated by the ISO and safety plans where they're necessary, but it's more a common sense approach here than it is in the hazmat world. Hand protection, ear protection, eye protection, head protection. If something's above your head, you want to make sure you have your head protected. Working with your hands, gloves would be indicated. High noise presence, hearing protection, so forth and so on. Accountability systems, accountability and comms kind of run hand in hand. These scenes have a potential to have a high amount of radio traffic. We will just have to handle that in a case-by-case basis. You may consider different channels, but all that will go into a comms plan if it were to be a larger scale incident. Accountability systems, whatever the established procedure is, we still use the blue card system regardless of what type of scene is, the type of the scene is rather. The accountability system is more important to prevent freelancing and self-deployment. And some of these larger incidents, it's very, very difficult for some of these well-trained folks. And even on the fire side, it's very difficult for you to notice something that needs to be done, have the ability to do it, but also have the self-control to stay back and not do it outside of receiving an order or making a recommendation. So that's a catch-22. We just want to make sure we have accountability for everybody that's on scene, and anybody who needs to communicate, we want to make sure they have the ability to do that. Rehab, something a little more unique to these extended rescue operations as opposed to the hazmat side. A system needs to be put in place, whether it's 13-minute mark and every 10 minutes after that, such as we do on working fires, or whatever the work period, work rest cycle is going to be. We cannot allow people to just keep working and working and working until they are completely spent, or to make decisions based on their comfort. We have to have some type of system, whether you choose the on deck or some type of work cycle, because if you work yourself completely ragged, it will increase your rehab time. And I understand the concept that everybody wants to work until the life is saved. Everybody wants to work until the task is complete, but you may end up going into multiple work cycles with this. And we want to make sure we're bringing crews that are able to be rehabbed to the point where they can go back for another work cycle later. We said we were coming back around to helicopter type stuff, so let's talk about it very quickly. We're seeing activity from AirMed more so than we ever have before, but when these helicopters show up, they do create some hazards of their own. Mainly it draws attention, but we also have some hazards associated with the aircraft itself. The rotor wash, that's the amount of air that it's pushing to the ground and kicking up flying debris, so forth and so on. The overhead rotor, sometimes those are tilted a little bit more towards the ground in the front than people realize. The tail rotor that's in the back, that's responsible for steering some of it. Both of those are moving a pretty good bit. And they also have a patient loading technique with air ambulances where they do a patient load or a patient transport without ever shutting the aircraft down. So that could be problematic in and of itself. So mishaps are pretty common with that, but some of the ways to avoid that, obviously we want to keep anybody who doesn't need to be in that landing zone out of it. Landing zone officer is going to have some safety issues to address. Communication with the pilot, communication with the crew is going to be the easiest way to remedy this. We have local ways of getting in touch with AirMed. I can't think of any other helicopters that would be coming to our area unless there's this massive extraordinary circumstance, and we would just have to cross that bridge when we get there. So approach aircraft from the front or the side. Some of the other hazards that were associated with it is going to be pilot communication more than anything, communication with that crew, and stay away from it unless you're instructed to go towards it.